You're listening to Operant Innovations, a podcast brought to you by ABA Technologies. This week on Thought Leaders, we'll be speaking with Tom Freeman as he introduces you to his life and how he came to the field of behavior analysis. We are talking today with my office buddy for now, Tom Freeman, who is the Senior Vice President at ABA Technologies. And he has been dedicated to ABA Tech's mission to disseminate the benefits of behavior science to the world. But in his role now, he helps create and present both the instructional content for the online program and also a lot of our online CE continuing education courses. But he has quite the background from what I've heard, just being able to share an office with him for the last 11 months. It's been 11 months. And I would like to hear and share with you more about it. So, Tom.
Hi.
Where did you come from? How'd you get here?
I was born in 1953. I was born in Chicago. We moved to New York when I was about 5 years old. So I lived on Long Island. Actually grew up on Long Island and always considered myself a New Yorker. I'm a big Yankee fan. Most families have their problems, and my family was reasonably dysfunctional. So I grew up in a situation I had two older sisters, and my parents were separated when I was 6 years old. I think it was a rather difficult separation. As I recall, the police came in and actually removed my father from the house. I was 6. Because he drank a lot. He was alcoholic. He was a very productive person. He worked in Madison Avenue. He was one of the madmen. He was an advertising man. And for my entire life that I can remember, he was working on the Reynolds metals count, Reynolds aluminum foil, oven tempered for flexible strength. That was my dad. That put me through college. So but those guys drank like fishes in those offices, and he was part of that culture. He'd grown up in a culture, his family was Germanic, and they always drank and sang at the bars, and so he grew up in a very heavily drinking society, and he became alcoholic, and he and my mom began to have major problems. She also had problems from her background, that she had a difficult upbringing as well. Her father died when she was 17, and it was just a difficult family life. They were from the South. And so my parents had their problems. My mom had some psychiatric problems. She'd actually been in a psychiatric hospital when I was very young, which I don't remember. But after my parents were separated, my mom was in and out of psychiatric facilities because she had very severe depression. She was a very sensitive person, extremely smart, but had a lot of problems. And so really suffered from major depression and had many suicide attempts. So as I was growing up, I began dealing with my mom's suicidal behavior when I was in junior high school, because that's the first suicide attempt I remember. And so she'd be going in and out of hospitals, and there were times when I would go visit her. In fact, with my dad not being there, he would come and visit us every Sunday, take us out. But, so I got kind of a interesting view of life from that perspective. I also became quite ill when I was young. I had asthma to the point where the doctors had thought I wouldn't survive. So they had told my parents I was probably going to die. I was in and out of oxygen tents. So I spent a lot of time in hospitals and spent a lot of time, at home, missing lots and lots of school. So I would sit around and read encyclopedias and write reports about things I was interested in. So I developed really bad study habits. I was a terrible student. I mean, early on it was fine. I would just go into school and I'd catch up. I'd miss 2 months worth of work and I'd catch up in a week. But by the time I got into high school and was having to deal with like calculus and stuff, it was not so good. So my first couple of years in college were pretty much of a throwaway. Given my parents' history, I too had a collegiate substance abuse problem, one might say. But then I got over it by the time I was a junior and started sort of knuckling down and working hard. I was a psych and an English major by the time I got out. When I went in, I thought I was going to be a physics and a astronomy major because I wanted to work for NASA and I wanted to do I just wanted to work for NASA basically. But between my substance abuse as a freshman, it didn't really go well with math classes and stuff. So, but I really was interested in psychology because I was interested in why people do what they do. Obviously, coming from my family background, there was a lot of stuff in there that I was trying to figure out. Why are people acting like this? So I was really interested in psychology. Strangely enough, interested in parapsychology because I really thought that people might have extrasensory perception. I wanted to study that because I thought it would be interesting to study that scientifically. So I was interested in that.
And I know that we've talked about your
Yeah,
ESP book.
ESP book, yeah.
That's sitting right here on your shelf.
I was very interested in that, and just to see what the science said. And what I found out by talking to a lot of people is that it was considered so strange and outside the mainstream that there was no way to get work in that field. There was no way to people just made fun of it. You couldn't really get serious funding for anything. And I even did my senior project actually in college. I got a psych professor to agree to do my senior project. The first half was to review all the research literature. The second half was to do my own experiment on precognition using a random number generator from a computer, which I actually got some results, but I learned some stuff from that was interesting because I had people fill out a questionnaire to say whether or not they thought that the precognition would exhibit itself in this experimental context, and that was what I used as my determining factor as to I was testing because I had this whole thing called sheeps and goats and people that were believers, non-believers. Anyway, the person who showed the most proclivity towards this, she had really high, way above chance in terms of her ability to predict these random numbers. And she said her grandmother had it and her mother had it and she had it. She totally believed in it, but she didn't believe it would show up in this experiment. And so her data completely skewed my data set to be she was a non-believer even though she was a believer. And so I got it was chance. If I had put her in the other group, I would have had results above chance. But you live and learn. So that was I actually had come across Skinner in college and had read Beyond Freedom and Dignity and thought, who is this guy? Who is this guy to talk about beyond freedom and dignity? And I found my paper recently that I wrote on that course in college. Yeah, I found the paper, and the first line of that paper is the interesting thing about B.F. Skinner is that he is such a terrible theoretician but an excellent experimenter. Which is actually sort of, in a way, true because he wasn't a theoretician. He was just, and I didn't understand. What he was getting at. It took me a while to figure out what was going on. Anyway, once I graduated college, I didn't want to go straight into grad school. I was sort of tired of academia and I wanted to get some real life experience. So I went out in the world to try to get a job. I wanted to work at an institution if I could, given I'd seen my mom in and out of institutions, and many times, I visited her at one institution one time when, it was when I was older and I was the only one home with her, and the cops actually had to knock down the door at our house because she had called a friend of hers and fallen asleep on the phone because she had taken Secanols. And I had come home from school and I was napping, so all of a sudden I hear the door being burst in by the cops and they come in and they take her. And she almost died that time, but she went to a hospital on Long Island, and so I went to visit her. And I tell you, the people that were the patients there seemed more sane than the people that were working there. The people that were working there were mean, and it was just, I felt really bad for the people that were living there because they didn't seem to be getting very good treatment, and they were easy to talk to, and they, you could see they were suffering, but man, the staff were just nasty. So I sort of got from that I wanted to work in some kind of institutional setting. I thought I was going to probably work in a mental hospital. So I moved to Boston. I was in New York, but I wanted to get out of New York. So I moved to Boston after college and started looking for jobs in institutions. But they wouldn't hire me because they said, you're overqualified for our lower level positions and you're underqualified for our psychological positions, even though you've got a degree in psych. So there's really not a position for you here. So I looked around, and then finally I went to this place called the Fernald State School, which is a residential school in Massachusetts, very large, first residential school for people with developmental disabilities in the country. And it was huge at one point. It was over 2,000 people. By the time I went there, it was about 1,000 people living there. I did my interview, and it scared the heck out of me, because they put me on, my interview was, I talked to somebody for about 15 minutes, and then they put me on the ward to provide coverage because they didn't have enough people. So I was on the ward with about 30 people with severe and profound, what they at that time they called mental retardation, severe and profound mental retardation, which was people that, and it smelled like feces and urine in the place, and people were walking around half dressed, and there was only one other staff person there, and there were like 20 people, and somebody came over to me and tried to lift me up and like put me on he wanted to apparently hang me up on the wall. I don't know what was going on, but it really freaked me out. So I left there, and then they called me to offer me the job, but I wasn't ready. And I went to work in the basically I went to work in the restaurant business. I was a busboy, which I loved that job. Still dream about it to this day now and then. I love being a busboy, because when you're a busboy, you're invisible. People don't know you're there. So I worked in this bar in Harvard Square where there were all these people coming in, and when you're bussing their table, they just keep talking. It's like you're not even there. So it was a very interesting place to work, and particularly interesting because it was run by a guy who had been one of Timothy Leary's original experimental subjects in LSD at Harvard, right? So this guy had like great stories. He invented CVS, and he created CVS and then sold it for a whole lot of money, and he bought this bar restaurant in Harvard Square and ran it. And there was such an interesting array of people working there. The guy that was the line chef was getting his PhD in ancient Chinese porcelain. He was also a weapons and demolitions expert that went off on military excursions now and then, as secret stuff. The guy that was the dishwasher that I worked with was his mother had been a college professor in Argentina, and then she had let the Tupamaros use her house for meetings, and they were like a sort of a Marxist revolutionary group, and they got caught, and then so he was implicated, and the government gave him the option to either go fight in Vietnam or to be in exile for 5 years. So he went in exile. So this is the guy that was the dishwasher. There was all kinds of people like that. It was a crazy place to work. One woman one day got a call, and she started jumping. A waitress got a call. She started jumping up and down. So, oh my God! She had been nominated for an Oscar for her small documentary called Kudzu, that had Jimmy Carter in it and stuff. She had made this documentary, and it got. I mean, those are the kind of people that were working at this bar restaurant, So it was like, this was an amazing place to work.
I mean, I've worked in restaurants and bars, but never with.
Well, it's Harvard Square. It's Harvard Square, right? So so there were crazy people working there, and it was a broad range of people. So anyway, I really liked that job, but I always felt like in the back of my mind that that Fernald was like exactly the kind of place that I really should do something. It really just freaked me out. So after about 2 years working in the restaurant business, I went back to Fernald and to see, okay, can I handle this now? In the interim, there had been a federal consent decree that the parents had brought a lawsuit, and there had been a federal consent decree for all of Massachusetts institutions, and so the federal government had taken over and said, we need active treatment here. Mm-hmm. So I saw Fernald. Before there was mandated active treatment, there were people there trying to do good work, right? There were people like B. Barrett was there, and unknown to me, Carl Binder. There were people that were there that were trying to do good stuff. Kent Johnson, I didn't know who these people were. But the consent decree changed things. And so all of a sudden I went back, and there was active treatment going on. It was better. It wasn't great, but it was better. So I took a job as a direct care staff person.
And when was that?
That was in... April 1st of 1979. April Fool's Day. April Fool's Day. Yes. So I started working at Fernald on April 1st of 79. It was a really interesting job. It was like going into a completely new... Like I worked with a group of men that had severe, profound developmental disabilities. It was a group of 12 guys, and it was a building that was 12 guys on one side, 12 guys on the other side, the east wing and the west wing. I worked on the west wing. The it was intense. People with really serious behavior problems. One guy, would try to break out of the building and so he could eat cigarette butts. Another guy would dive headfirst into the corners of tables and had golf ball sized swellings above each of his eyes. There were just all kinds of just intense behaviors there. Stuff I'd never seen before, stuff I didn't even know existed. And I worked under the tutelage of a behavior analyst there named Mike Lowry, who was really good. I learned a lot from him. And he would have me do things that I was learning about shaping, and I started learning about how these things worked. And honestly, I didn't come to sort of the radical behaviorism as a academic becoming like an acolyte of Skinner. I came to it because what works, right? And I saw the effect of this approach working with people who were identified as incapable of learning when people could learn new things, right? But at the same time, the institution was understaffed, and I would oftentimes have to work forced overtime shifts. There was one time when I had to work a forced triple overtime because the staff didn't show up for the 11. I worked from the 3 to 11 shift. Staff didn't show up for the 11 to 7, so I had to stay there overnight to cover. And then in that morning, staff didn't show up. So now I'm covering the morning shift after having worked 2 straight shifts. And I was at the point like, I can't do this anymore. Yeah. This was about 8 months in. I liked the work. I liked the people I was working with, but it was starting to burn me out. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that worked there, named Kristen Kinnett, who worked at the Laborers Hall, said, well, you should go apply for this. Actually, Kristen had worked at Laborers Hall. Anyway, said you should go apply for this job. Okay, so I went up. There was this building at the top of Fernald, at the very top of the hill, called Kelly Hall, which was it had the reputation of being the worst building on grounds. And I wanted to see, what does the worst building on grounds look like? So I went up there. They had an opening for a supervisor. So I went up and applied for a supervisor. And in my interview, Kirsten worked there, and she said, well, there's a job opening as an assistant staff psychologist, and you got a psych degree, so why don't you apply for the assistant staff psychologist position, which I did. And I got that position. So then I'm starting to work as a, quote, assistant staff psychologist. But it was behavioral. Right, the head of the department was Charlie Hammond, who was great. There was the Shriver Center was there, the Eunice Shriver Center that did research. Yeah. So I was working in this environment where I had a caseload. I worked under a psychologist named Greg Daramengian, who was great, taught me everything I knew about how to run a staff meeting, really how to write good programs, data collection, and doing graphing, real world behavior analysis. But this is early on. This is before Awada's article. This is before we were looking at functions. This is in the sort of the behavior modification days in institutional work. So, I saw kind of the real early phases of the implementation of behavior analysis in institutions, and then the evolution of how things got better, how active treatment got better, how people started moving out of the institutions into group homes. I saw, and in my time there, I worked at Kelly Hall for about 4 years, but then I went to some other caseloads for a variety of reasons. But I worked with people that were in wheelchairs, for example. Mm-hmm. Worked with people that were only had mild or moderate disability, and so were able to talk, were able to go off outside the institution, had all kinds of different problems. I got tasked to be the basically the psych department rep to the sexuality committee, so we fielded like all of the issues where there were sexual things regarding people in their various buildings. This place was huge. It had like 60 buildings and many clients, so all different levels, people with all different kinds of problems, dual diagnosis, all kinds of stuff, children, adults, people, all kinds of stuff. So I got to see a lot of stuff, and the department head there kept trying to get me to go into the MABA program, the Massachusetts Applied Behavior Analysis. It was UMass had like a behavior analysis program there, and I thought about it, but I didn't really want to go to grad school. So I worked there for a while, and in 1984, It's a long story of how I found out about this, but I found out there was this place called Earthwatch that people could pay money to go be volunteers on scientific research projects. And I hadn't had a vacation for a really long time. My mom had cancer, and I'd be going home all the time to help deal with my mom in New York. And I needed a vacation. So I saw that there was this thing called Earthwatch where you could go participate in a research project. And one of the research projects they had was something I was particularly interested in, which was language, teaching language to animals. Right? I was really interested in the chimpanzee research, the language research they were doing when I was back at Harvard Square. I was taking courses at like the Harvard Extension and linguistics and stuff, just so I could look at like language training with animals. And so in Hawaii, they were doing language training with dolphins at this lab called the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Lab in Honolulu. So I went out there as a volunteer. I had accumulated all my vacation time. I had a month, so I took a month off to go work at the dolphin lab. And it was really cool.
It sounds really cool.
One of the reasons I wanted to go to Hawaii in the meantime was that there was a volcano erupting, and I thought I could go out there and see a volcano. So
Did you see a volcano?
I saw it had stopped erupting by the time I got out there.
Oh.
But I did see a wall of really hot rock that I started climbing up on, and the bottom my shoes started to melt. So it was pretty cool. It was a wall of rock that had not been there like a week before. It had come down the slope into this place called the Royal Gardens District, which, by the way, is no longer there. So that was really cool. And so then I came back to Massachusetts and worked some more. And then I had always wanted to travel extensively, because my whole life all the information I had about the world was filtered through other people.
Yeah.
Right? And I figured I want to see what's really out there. So I had been saving money. I didn't have a car this whole time. So I didn't have to spend all this money on an automobile.
The funny thing is that doesn't surprise me at all about you, that you didn't have a car.
I took the bus, and I would walk to work. So, but that allowed me to save money. Even though I wasn't making that much money at Fernald, I could save money. And so I wanted to travel. I'd always wanted to go to China. So I wanted to go see China, go see like the Himalayas and stuff, and travel. I really like volcanoes too, so I really wanted to do a volcano tour. So in preparation for leaving, because I decided I'm going to leave and go on this trip in like 1986, there were Earthwatch projects that I saw that I figured, well, I can do these projects as I go. So there's one project that's affiliated with the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Lab that is a humpback whale project, where they're studying humpback whales in the wild. They're not doing language training with dolphins at like the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Lab, where the dolphins are in captivity, which was really interesting. And the dolphins did learn word strings, although it was all receptive. And it would be really interesting to see if Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior were to be used now in doing language training with animals, because as far as I know, it never has been. Nobody's ever used Skinner's analysis to apply to trying to teach animals language. But in the meantime, or verbal behavior. But in the meantime, there was this whale project that looked really interesting, and it was studying whales in the wild. And then there was this orangutan project that was studying orangutans in the wild that looked really interesting, and I'd heard really good things about it. So I decided that while I go to Asia, I will go to these two research projects on the way, and then kind of launch into China, and who knows what will happen. So I went in 1986 in March. I left, and I went to the humpback whale research project. And I got along with those people really well. We'd go out on boats and would look for pods of whales, and then we'd try to keep the boat behind them and track them and take pictures of the underside of their flukes. We also had a shore station where they were doing experiments where sometimes the boat would put a speaker underwater. It's called a J9 and then a J11. They're big underwater speakers, and would play back whale sounds to the whales. And the shore station would be there and would be tracking the movements of all the whale pods, the groups of whales in the area, through using a theodolite, one of those surveyor's tools, and a little field computer there, Commodore, I think it was. The trash. No, it's TRS. It's TRS-80. It's trash. So that was a Radio Shack computer, right, in those days. And,
Radio Shack.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we had the shore station, we had the boats, and then we had a little zodiac that would also just track whales and get their fluke identification, because we were trying to see who was traveling with who and see if we could determine social groups. So anyway, we'd play back sounds of the whales underwater and then see did it have an impact on the whales. There was like a control tape. There were social sounds from Alaska. There were feeding sounds from Alaska. And there was a humpback whale song from the prior year, because the song of a humpback whale evolves year to year. New themes come in, old themes drop out, but everybody's basically singing the same song, like, but they sound different. It's like, you've got Frank Sinatra singing My Way versus Sid Vicious singing My Way. They sound different, but it's the same song. So we would play sounds back and found that the whales would basically rush the boat, or about 20% of the pods in the area would rush the boat when we play the feeding sound. And then they'd go by the speaker and then they'd swim away, but it drew them in. So we had to be really careful. That tape was, because we don't want the whalers to get, a hold of that. But they did use that tape for Humphrey the humpback whale that went up the Sacramento River. That's the tape that they used to draw him back out of the Sacramento River. They were trying to use seal bombs and all kinds of stuff to turn him around.
Right.
And the skin was starting to slough off. He was getting in trouble. But the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Lab was on the conference call, and they said, well, we've got this tape. And then they used the tape to draw him back out
That's
into the
awesome.
Pacific Ocean. Yeah, it was cool. So I worked with them in '86. And then I went on my journey into Asia, right? And I get to the orangutan project, and I work there where we go in the rainforest and are working with ex-captive orangutans that are there in the Camp Leakey, that was named after Louis B. Leakey, that was run by this woman named Birute Galdikas, and she was one of the 3 women that Louis Leakey mentored. There was Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Birute. Jane Goodall went to work with the chimps, Diane Fossey went to work with the gorillas, and then Birute went to work with the orangutans. She was the youngest. So working in the rainforest was really incredible. It was amazing, because we would get up in the morning, we'd track the orangutans in the wild, take data on them, collect their scat, see what kind of food they were eating, and then when they would bed down for the night, they build a new nest every night to sleep in, and then we would make our way back to camp. And the rule was dinner wouldn't start till everybody got back to camp, and sometimes it was like dark. And then if you were on an orangutan, then you would have to get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, go out with the Dayak, who are the native people that live in Borneo, and they would be our guides, and then we'd go out and sit and wait for the orangutan to wake up and then track them. And the rule was 3 days and no more, if you could stay with them. So it was amazing, because you'd be out there at night when the rainforest is waking up, right? So when the dawn is happening in the rainforest, it's incredible, because it's like this symphony. It's sort of like you hear it start to wake up. I can't really describe it. It's sort of overwhelming, because the baboons start to wake up, and everybody starts to make noise, but it's sort of this. It sounds like an orchestra tuning up. Anyway, that was incredible, and I was out there for a couple of weeks, which is, interestingly enough, where I met my future wife. I'm from Long Island, she was from New Jersey, and we met in Borneo. So anyway, it took a while for us to get together, but because we were on different continents for one thing. But in any case, after that, I stayed in Indonesia for a little while, and I went back to Hong Kong and was about to launch into China, and I got a telegram from my mom saying she needed me to come home, that there was a big, anyway, it was all kinds of family stuff. I had to go home. My mom, I told you my mom had cancer, and anyway, so I went home and I lived with her for a year trying to sell our house, and it was I feel that I mutated in that year, because it was hard. It was very hard. They invited me back to the Whale Project and I couldn't go, and it was hard. But after we finally got the house sold and I got my mom resettled in South Georgia, which is where she originally grew up, I went back to the Whale Project in '88, and I worked in the Whale Project from then on. I was the I didn't pay in 1988 when I went to work there. I was like the Earthwatch liaison, so I was responsible for all the volunteers. And then the next year I went back, and I was a staff person. The next year I went back, and I was the assistant field director. The next year I went back. The next year I didn't go back, but I did go to Hawaii because I had to go testify to whale harassment trial. And then the next 2 years I went back as the field director. because I had the most experience of anybody, and they didn't have any grad students that knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So they needed somebody to keep the project going
Yeah.
who knew how to do it. So in 93 and 94 and 95, I went back as field director.
And so were all of these like little small projects?
Well,
or
it was
did it stretch
Humpback Whale
into
project.
more of like a full-time job rather than
It
just
did
the
not
volunteers?
stretch. It was see, whales are seasonal. They only go
Right.
to Hawaii between January
Okay.
and March or April, right? So that's when I go, was
Mm-hmm.
January, March, or April. In the meantime, I started working on a dolphin project that was up the coast and working with spinner dolphins. But I would always go back to Massachusetts and get a job at Fernald, right? But
Okay.
I became sort of like this hired gun, where I would go into caseloads and sort of work on a caseload and either straighten things out. And then they stopped having me do that, and I started being what was called a QMRP at that time, which stood for Qualified Mental Retardation Professional, basically case manager.
Yep. Well-read individuals and most like well-rounded, like the types of books that and topics that you and I have gotten into conversations about. So I can
Yeah.
like just imagine the types of things you were reading and looking into yourself during this time frame.
That's an interesting question. I when I travel, obviously, I read a lot, because it was really interesting. When you travel, you're outside of your group.
Right.
You're no longer a group identification, right? So you get in these different groups. There's like groups of people that are on the road that start seeing each other at, like, guest houses and stuff. Because I didn't want to stay at big hotels. I wanted to stay in, like, local
Hostels and-
Right, exactly. But then there's always like book exchanges there, right? So
Yes.
I read a lot of Jean le Carré. I had already read a lot of Hermann Hesse, but I read a lot of Hermann Hesse. I read Faulkner. I read a lot of Doris Lessing. I love Doris Lessing's work, Children of Violence series, and a lot of that. I read C.S. Lewis. I read some science fiction, Isaac Asimov, and then I was reading, gosh, I can't. That's an interesting question. I'll have to remember. I mean, I used to read like lots voraciously. I used to read, and now I don't do that so much anymore.
You're kind of busy.
Yeah,
You're a little bit busy right now.
a little bit. Yeah, a little
But I mean,
bit.
I can just see like the history of stuff that you're reading
Yeah,
or have read
and I read a
sitting
lot of
behind me on your bookcase.
comparative religion stuff. I read a lot of Sufi literature, a lot of like Buddhism, a lot of different religions. I was really interested in different religions. I've been to lots of different, like, temples and the Kingdom Hall for basically I'm really interested in the religious experience. So I was reading a lot of that, a lot of philosophy, a lot of like D.T. Suzuki, and then Krishnamurti. I really liked that stuff. I liked the various. I was just reading all this stuff about people trying to figure out, what is this all about? And I basically came to the conclusion that it's a big mystery. Nobody really knows, and we just basically try to do the best we can. That there's stuff going on that we can't perceive because our perceptual networks are limited, and there's stuff going on all around us that we don't know about, and I'm okay with that. And that I don't think that we have really any clue about what's happening, and so we do the best we can. And science gives us a way to try to understand how the universe works around us the best that we possibly can, and that's a good thing because it allows us to do things and to affect change and to do things. But I don't think that we've got this all pegged by any possible degree. I think there's a lot going on that is really interesting, that would be nice to find out about. That's one of the reasons I was interested in like extrasensory perception, because it indicates something sort of beyond our current understanding of the Newtonian sort of a priori space and time, or linear and continuous. I don't know that that's exactly right, because we keep expanding our knowledge of sort of how things work, and human beings always seem to go into these new areas that really shock people. They're paradigm shifts, and that's one of the reasons Skinner is so interesting, is because it's a paradigm shift. It's that our thoughts don't cause behavior, our thoughts basically are behavior. And so that's a really profound change in terms of seeing our place in the universe.
And it still is.
It still is.
Which is funny to think about. It still is to this day to people.
Oh, for sure. But it's funny because if you look back at like Copernicus, right? When Copernicus concluded, that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and the sun doesn't go around the Earth, the Earth goes around the sun, right? Well, 50 years later, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for basically preaching Copernicus. So it took a long time. People think that, everybody got that, and then everybody understood that the Earth was not the center of the universe. It took like centuries. Yeah. And people still to this day think the Earth is flat, Yes. So these things take a while. These big shifts in perspective take a while to sort of infuse into society. It's same with Einstein. The whole people were saying everything is relative when I was growing up. Oh, everything is relative. Well, that's straight out of Einstein from like 75 years ago.
I know that's still one of my answers to. Somebody asks me anything, I'm like, that's relative.
Right.
Just depending on the
depends
situation.
On
like,
where you're looking at it from, it depends on your perspective. So, yeah. So, anyway, after all that, I eventually, I was in Massachusetts. I was playing in a rock band. I was playing Grateful Dead and Allman Brothers. I was doing all kinds of stuff. But in the meantime...
That also doesn't surprise me
all. Yeah, it was good.
Tom and I have also connected on our love for eclectic music as well.
Yep. I've been in bands that played everything from Bob Dylan and the Beatles to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So it's, try to play Miles Davis stuff, and I say trying it, not very well. But so anyway, having met the person that would eventually be my wife in Borneo, we were in letter contact. We were writing letters to each other for a long time, and she came to visit me in Hawaii before she decided to get out of her career, and she was working in like defense industries, computer stuff in Washington D.C. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted to work out in the wild. And so, in any case, she came before going to school. She went back to grad school in Yale School of Forestry. And before going to grad school, she wanted to come to Hawaii and take a trip. And so I said, hey, come see me at the Whale Project. And she came to visit, and we realized we should probably be together. And so after that, it took a while because we kept being on different continents, because she's off studying gorillas in Africa or studying Cebus monkeys in Argentina, and I'm in Hawaii, So it took us a few years, but we finally got married in 1996.
I was going to say, don't get this wrong.
Yeah, I know. So I moved to Florida. Kathy had gotten a job in Florida working for the Nature Conservancy, doing land reclamation and stuff, and doing GIS. She does like mapping and stuff. And so she had moved to Florida. I was in Massachusetts, and I kept visiting her, and we were on the phone every night. And so realizing I could do what I do, which is, working in the area, especially at that time, of developmental disabilities, because most of my experience was with adults with developmental disabilities, that I could do that pretty much anywhere. Versus she had gotten a job after she got out of grad school working for the Nature Conservancy here in Florida, and it was like her ideal job. So I decided, okay, I'll move to Florida. And in the interim, I went to, before moving down here, because I moved here in December of 95, we got married in 96. I went to a FABA conference, Florida Association Behavior Analysis Conference, in 95, which is where I met Jose. And because somebody I had worked with at Fernald introduced me to Jose.
Thank you for listening to Thought Leaders from Operant Innovations. Join us in a couple weeks as we continue our talk with Tom Freeman to see where he thinks the field of behavior analysis is going and where he would like to see it go. As always, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at operantinnovations@abatechnologies.com.